You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
This afternoon, I sat down with Dr. Jill Titus, and she's the Associate Director of the Civil War Institute and a professor at Gettysburg College. We talked about the centennial celebrations of the Battle of Gettysburg. She's got a book that she's working on. It's not out yet. It's almost finished. But it's on the subject of the centennial celebrations. And what a fascinating period in American history that is. A lot of things you'll find, centennial is 100 years. So 100 years has gone by since the Civil War, and things aren't exactly all hunky-dory. So in 100 years, the war is still has left a lot of things a lot of questions unanswered, a lot of issues unsettled. And she comes in, Dr. Titus comes in to talk about some of the things that are pertinent to the centennial celebration. And I just found it very interesting. I don't really know anything about the centennial celebration, just a couple of little anecdotes that I've picked up from here and there and this person and that person. And so I wanted to have her come in and talk about it. I met her just the other day over at the Civil War Institute. I went in there for a meeting and they introduced me to her, and making small talk, she said that she was working on this. And I said, oh, you got to come in and do the show. My audience will love this, because I bet you most of them haven't really heard much of this stuff. I know I haven't, and it's very interesting. So why don't we just get right to it right now? It's Dr. Jill Titus, Associate Director, Civil War Institute, and Professor at Gettysburg College, and myself talking about the Civil War of the 1960s, the Gettysburg Centennial Celebration. What is America like in 1963 as opposed to now, or 1863? What was it like back then? What was going on?
Well, America is a country filled with a great deal of turmoil, a great deal of tension. There are racial demonstrations breaking out across the country. Big ones like the demonstrations in Birmingham. Important ones that we don't hear as much about, like demonstrations that were happening right here in York. Large-scale demonstrations about police brutality. Medgar Evers, the civil rights leader from Mississippi, was assassinated that summer. John F. Kennedy announces that he's sending legislation to Congress for a new civil rights bill. Tensions are hot everywhere. Internationally, we're in the midst of a very hot period of the Cold War. People are feeling threatened. People are feeling concerned. They are looking for stability. And at the same time, they're also looking for change. This is a period where events are speeding up beyond, and they're moving faster than most people are ready for. And there's a lot of questioning of, Can the American democratic experiment survive both the international tensions of the Cold War, and can it survive this level of sustained grassroots protest at home?
Now, you mentioned how everything is kind of in turmoil and everything. And I noticed I talked to a lot of people who were alive back then, like my father, for example. In his memory, everything started going south when Kennedy was killed, which would be in November of '63. But you're saying that even leading up to that, things were not so great.
Absolutely. I mean, and to a certain extent, like anything in history, it depends on who you are and where you are, what your experience is. But certainly for African Americans, the 1950s are a period of a lot of turmoil, a lot of tension, a lot of rising activity. The sit-in movement breaks out in 1960. You have major crises about desegregation of American schools starting in the mid-1950s and extending well through the 1960s and into the 1970s. You have intensive clashes over civil rights happening, in places like Albany, Georgia. You have James Meredith trying to integrate the University of Mississippi in 1962 and needing federal marshals in order to do so. A riot breaks out.
Was that George Wallace?
That was Ross Barnett. George Wallace is 1963. It's another 1963. Okay. Then this is literally 3 weeks before he comes to Gettysburg that summer. He is standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama going, head to head with the Justice Department saying segregation forever, and then stepping aside for the court order to go into effect.
So he follows the court order,
right,
but he has his little protest
You
first.
also have the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962,
right.
The scale of fear, that touched many Americans at that point was something pretty unprecedented.
All right, so let's start at the 20,000-foot level and work down to Gettysburg in 1963. So you mentioned the Cold War. We have the Cold War going on, a threat from without. Aside from fears of nuclear attack, how does that threat affect American life on a day-to-day basis, aside from, having to dive under your desk for drills and things like that?
Sure. Well, there's fear about how fast is communism spreading? How far is communism spreading? Could communist countries eventually get a majority in the United Nations and be able to vote in ways that would be opposed to American interests? You have the fear, particularly with nations like Cuba that are close to the United States. What happens if these countries become part of the Soviet bloc? What happens when you are in range for some kind of assault, whether nuclear or not? There's the concern that American troops who are posted, all over Europe, all over Asia, are going to increasingly be drawn into armed conflict, as certainly happened in Vietnam by the late 1960s. There's also, I think, that the fear that communism is everywhere in the United States. There were many Americans, white Americans, who tended to see any form of civil rights protest as simply a cover for communism. There was concern that any growth of the welfare state would necessarily be communist driven, that any changes to traditional racial practices in the United States would be directed from the Kremlin.
Gettysburg, the Civil War itself, when the centennial celebrations begin, not for Gettysburg, but for the war, what is the attitude at other events, like for other battles that took place in the years before? Are they using it as some kind of a tool to, pull everything together today? How is it used?
Well, I think like most things, there are the official goals, and then there's what actually happens when you try to do something.
Right.
The architects of the Civil War centennial were by and large Cold Warriors who believed that commemorating the Civil War would be an excellent way to increase national unity, to kind of draw Americans together behind a unified narrative about what their political ideals were, that this would unify North and South, that this would demonstrate to the world that Americans were willing to die for their political principles, and it would be a good reminder of America's military tradition, America's military might.
Right.
The hope was that the Cold War could remind Americans, from school children to the elderly, of who they were at some fundamental core level, which of course would be in their minds diametrically opposed to everything about communism, that this would be the antidote to sort of a sliding toward communism.
Because the Civil War, we fought against and defeated slavery of one race. Communism enslaves the whole population. Is that kind of what it is that they're saying? That is an argument that some are making, but it's not the majority. Okay. Frankly, for the original idea of the Civil War being this unifying force about American political equality really didn't take slavery into consideration at all, and certainly didn't think about sort of African-American investment in narratives of the Civil War. Wait, say that again. Say that again. I just want to make sure we're clear on what you're saying here.
So I think the original idea was that it's the Civil War. When they were thinking about the Civil War as
The centennial generation?
The centennial architects, the people who planned it, the people who put it together, they were not thinking very much about historical specifics. They were not thinking about slavery as the fundamental cause of the Civil War. They were thinking about sort of martial glory and brothers' war and the idea that the United States engaged in this horrible bloodletting but emerged stronger. The narrative that the Civil War and the reunification after the Civil War allowed the U.S. to grow into this international power by the mid-20th century was the heart and soul of their impression of the Civil War.
Got it. Okay.
We're talking about traditional American values here, not so much about slavery and emancipation. Of course, if they had looked deeper, they may have been a little more quick to question whether a narrative of the Civil War could really unify a diversity of people in the United States when there's still so much debate over the causes of the war, the conduct of the war, the extent to which the outcome was right or wrong.
Right, because this is 100 years after the war. I mean, I just went and saw 1917. So it's 100 years after World War I. I remember as a little kid, World War I veterans being alive still. So 100 years is not as long as it sounds, is my point, right? So there are still people that maybe had a parent or a grandparent who fought in the Civil War and heard stories, heard their side of things. So the politics of the war, of how we look at the war, are different in 1963. And as they are in any generation, every generation since the war looked at it differently. The younger generations looked at it differently than the participants did.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's constantly shifting. And there certainly was a good bit of agreement among white Americans, at least, about a narrative of the war that was fairly, I don't know what the best word would be,
sanitized?
Sort of a consensus narrative of the war.
Right. Okay. This is what we agree about.
Right. That focused very much on battlefield heroics, that focused on the common soldier, the experiences, the suffering of the common soldier, the idea that that was universal, Confederate, Union, that it's not that cause was less important than the actual conduct of the war, and the idea that bloodletting on battlefields emphasizes sort of the heroism and the courage of the Civil War soldier, which is something that lives in every American. That idea of a brothers' war was very popular at the time, and there were many people who subscribed to it.
It's very romantic.
Yes, absolutely. But as tensions over civil rights heated up and use of Confederate symbols became more and more associated with massive resistance, there emerged an interpretation of the war that argued in more clear language the idea of the South being right, the idea that Confederate memory is our bulwark against an integrated society, that Confederate memory is our bulwark against
You're talking as you're nearing the centennial.
Yes.
And then afterwards too.
Yes. And at the same time, the reinvigoration of civil rights protest also intensified the other narrative, being that the Civil War was a struggle for freedom and it's unfinished, and we are continuing that struggle today.
If you look at movies about the Civil War in the 40s and 50s, I certainly haven't seen all of them, but the ones that I have seen, they seem to take, cause isn't really a part of it. You're just a dirty Yank or a dirty Reb, but we don't exactly know why. And one of my favorites is called The Horse Soldiers with John Wayne. I don't know if you've ever seen this one.
I haven't seen it.
You've heard of it.
I'm familiar with it.
It's based on I think it's the Grierson raid. I can't remember the guy's name now, but something like that. It's based on an actual raid down in Louisiana. So you don't watch it for the history. You watch it for John Wayne. So, but every time there's a few scenes where they capture a little town and there's a couple of Confederates there that they capture, and one of them's a colonel, and he I think he's missing an arm, but whatever. when they get a shot of him as he's talking to John Wayne, he's in like halo lighting, and he's standing very tall and proud with his puffed out chest and everything. And, John Wayne's covered in dirt and, because he's just been out in the field and everything. And you're right. They kind of present the Confederates almost as in a more heroic way, yet they lost. So I don't understand. How is the hero the guy that lost?
Well, that's a lost cause.
Yeah. Exactly. So, okay. So now we get to 1963. It's going to be Gettysburg. It's their turn at bat. Now, you said something before we started recording that interested me, and that was that there's a lot of writings or studies or scholarships that you can find, or scholastic work that you can find out there about everything, well, basically everything but Gettysburg during the centennial years, which is the reverse of everything else, right? Why do you think that? Explain that more.
Yeah, well, there's not a huge body of scholarship on the Civil War centennial in general. Right. It is fairly small, although it is growing. But it's true that what exists very rarely deals with Gettysburg in any significant detail. Usually what you see about Gettysburg in those studies is kind of brief mention of George Wallace's presence here in July of 1963.
Yeah.
And not a lot else. And I think that the biggest reason for that, it's kind of prosaic, but a lot of those studies have followed the activities of the United States Civil War Centennial Commission, which was the federal commission established in 1957 to oversee centennial activities across the country. And that commission had nothing to do with the Gettysburg anniversary. And so if they're the backbone, against which a study is being written, there's not going to be much about Gettysburg. Gettysburg is a commemoration that is planned and organized very much on a state level and on a local level. And those visions don't always line up perfectly.
Yeah.
It's also, though, interestingly, because in the 1960s, which I think it would still be true today, for many people, Gettysburg was the Civil War. Gettysburg was the shorthand to the American Civil War. If people
knew anything, the gateway drug.
Exactly. If people knew anything about a Civil War battlefield, it was Gettysburg. If people knew anything about a Civil War battle, it was Gettysburg. Certainly, the Gettysburg Address plays a big role in that. But the fact that Gettysburg at the time is the Civil War, still is today for many people, but.
Yeah.
When our understanding of the centennial doesn't bring Gettysburg into play, we're missing a lot of important things.
What do you mean? Explain that. What do you mean?
It would be like trying to understand a topic and taking out the most important chapter.
Gotcha.
It also, when we don't look at Gettysburg, we kind of overstate the role of the Federal Commission. We don't have a very clear understanding of how grassroots activities perpetuated the centennial. We don't have a very good understanding of how grassroots organizations worked to mobilize to, make centennial activities happen in their own community, because this is happening across the country. The Federal Commission is, it's doing its work. But
what do they say? What is the Federal Commission overseeing? And I just want to say I find it ironic that in a time of a big scare of communism, that the Civil War used as a tool to help bolster the nation to fight against communism has a central planning commission.
Well, it's funny because there was a lot of debate about that at the time.
Okay.
And really, the role of the Federal Commission was intended to be more of a clearinghouse than anything else. Most states had their own Civil War Centennial Commission, and most activities were carried out either on a local level or a state level. The Federal Commission's role was more to connect these disparate groups, to publicize information, to have a newsletter, to provide a sounding board, to offer advice. The activities that they are best known for are a commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation at the Lincoln Memorial that basically never mentions the word slavery. Their connections to the 1961 reenactment at Manassas that is so disastrous on so many levels that it sparks the NPS's no more reenactment on Parkland.
Is that where that comes from?
Yes, it comes out of the Civil War centennial.
Oh, interesting.
But looking at the Federal Commission...
I gotta know, because people are listening. They're like, wait, what happened? What happened?
The press was horrible. The coverage was terrible. The event itself was it was not run by the Federal Commission, and it was not run by the Park Service, but the Park Service is deeply, deeply involved. And it's very popular, draws tons of people, super expensive. You have, hot dog stands there on the battlefield. You have spectators in bleachers who are yelling and cheering and screaming as the soldiers are falling. You have people eating their cotton candy as they're watching this. There's a lot of vitriol directed particularly against the Union reenactors. It's a kind of a public people enjoyed it. It got good reviews from the people who participated. But of course, reenacting is in its infancy in 1961. What we would term authenticity is not in.
It's not a thing,
right? So the coverage is just terrible. Basically, it's this is a desecration of the battlefield. You had there's. I have heard from multiple people that archaeology at Manassas today continues to turn up artifacts from the 1961 reenactment. And for a period of time, they were finding far more from 1961 than they were from 1861.
That would be higher up on the soil, yeah.
But there's this sense that how crass is this? That as Americans, the way we commemorate this massive bloodletting, this huge debate over our ideals as a people is by watching people fake die while eating cotton candy.
I have always thought that was weird. I mean, even now, when we don't do it on the battlefield, but you go somewhere and you see a reenactment, I'm eating funnel cake after I just had a giant turkey leg that was smoked and delicious. And I'm watching people pretend to die because people actually really did die at one time. And it is all very, I remember when I, because I lived here twice. I lived here until 2010, and then I moved away back to New Jersey, and I came back in 2018. And I remember when I was at I think it was a baptism or something, and I said to my uncle that I'm moving back here. And later on, my father told me that when I was not around them, they had a conversation, and my uncle goes, "So Matt's moving back to Gettysburg, huh?" My dad said, "Yeah." He goes, "Don't you think that's weird?" He's like, "Why?" He loves it that. He goes, "Yeah." He's like, "People died there." It's like, why does he want to go to a place where a bunch of people died? And I said, when my father told me that, he thought, that, I don't know, like, I guess he thought it was humorous. And I said, well, that's exactly why I want to go here, because I don't understand why I'm drawn to it. Mm-hmm. And I want to go and try to fit. It's more about me than anything else. Like, for myself, why did I feel miserable in New Jersey? And why do I feel happy and at home here, where misery is the only reason that I know the name Gettysburg, because of all this horrible stuff that happened here, Yeah. And so, but that gets into a whole different thing.
People have been trying to figure that out for 150 years. I think Bruce Catton gives a fiery speech here in 1962 about reenactments. And he doesn't hold back. He says it's the equivalent of having a strawberry festival in a cemetery. How can we do this?
But this, exactly. Imagine this. If we had Jeffrey Dahmer murder reenactments, like you got to go to an apartment that was set just the way his is, and you get to watch a guy reenact the different murders that Jeffrey Dahmer committed. We'd all be like, that is disgusting. Like, what is wrong with you people? That is somebody's son. Like, what, well, what's the difference? Because it's 150 years old, it's okay to do?
Well, there's a major staff change on the Federal Commission. There's a sort of debacle in 1961. You have the Manassas reenactment. You have the convention in Charleston commemorating the firing on Fort Sumter that devolves into this huge civil rights battle, major conflict over segregated hotels in the city. And it's just a disaster. The executive director and the chairman of the federal commission both leave, and Alan Nevins and Bud Robertson, who just died very recently, come in as the new staff. And Robertson in particular is adamantly against reenactments. And for the rest of the centennial, he advises every group imaginable to stay as far away from reenactments as possible. The Pennsylvania Gettysburg Commission, the group charged with organizing this commemoration, at first they want a reenactment. But after the federal commission comes out strongly against it, after the Park Service says no, they have to completely kind of go back to the drawing board and replan what they're going to do for 1963, because their original idea was something along the lines of what was done at Manassas.
So what happens? What do they end up doing anyway? For the events of the centennial celebration. And I didn't know that Bud died. I just saw him last October, a year ago.
He died just a few months ago.
From what?
I'm not sure.
Oh, that's sad. Okay, so I'm sorry, I sidetracked there. So what was the centennial like here in Gettysburg? What were the big events?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question, because there are the formal official events planned by the official organizers, and then there's everything that traditionally happens in Gettysburg every year that just became much bigger between 1961 and 1965. There were things planned by other groups between 1961 and 1965. It's not just 1963. There's special things happening, across the span of 5 years. But in 1963 itself, there's the summer commemoration and there's the November commemoration. Summer commemoration originally was intended to be 4 days in July, each with a different theme. Gets scaled back to 3 after John F. Kennedy says, "No, I'm not coming to give an address." The idea was, Wilson came here and spoke. FDR came here and spoke. Both on major anniversaries, Kennedy will come and do the same thing. And Kennedy did not. He was invited in both July and November, and he declined.
And why not? Why did he decline?
Most historians argue that, in 1963, Kennedy had taken, several steps forward on civil rights, but he was still very much trying to avoid getting drawn into open conflict with segregationist senators.
Got it.
And the thought is that coming to Gettysburg, giving a speech about the Civil War in 1963, in the context of the summer of 1963, even the fall of 1963, that there would be no way to avoid talking about civil rights. And this is after Lyndon Johnson comes here in May of 1963 and gives a speech that is essentially a response to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, a speech that is all about civil rights, a speech where he essentially acknowledges that the administration that he's part of needs to do more. It's believed that Kennedy couldn't have ducked that conversation if he had come. In September of 1962, this anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation program that I briefly mentioned earlier, they invite Kennedy, and again, he doesn't come. He sends a taped message to sort of distance himself from it. The whole commemoration, like I said, they barely mention slavery. It's all about Cold War politics. It's all about political slavery across the world, across the globe. It's not historically specific at all, and it doesn't in any way talk about the legacies of racial discrimination in the U.S. So it's thought that Kennedy simply didn't want the political flack.
But he did, was it 63 or 62 that he did come here and take a tour?
He came here in 63. He came here in March. March,
April, something like early.
He came, I think the guide who did his tour found out that he was coming like 24 hours in advance, and he practically stayed up all night planning this tour. It wasn't announced. It was intended to be as quiet and as quick as possible. And as as soon as people caught on to the fact that this was the president touring the battlefield and like the motorcade started to get really, really long, they did a quick like about face and went down a one-way road to get him back out to the airport, to get him back out of town.
So his tour was interrupted.
Yes.
Tour interrupted. I mean,
it was they had hit most of the major spots, but to get back to your question about what's going on. So you have these. So Kennedy doesn't come. They scrap the plans for a major 4th of July activity, but they have July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. You have July 1st. There's a massive ceremony out at the Peace Light. There's a dedication of the Postal Service dedicates a new stamp. A deed of land is donated to the Department of the Interior.
Do you know which piece of land? It's not important if you don't.
Can't think of it off the top of my head.
It's not important. I was just
it's a ceremony kind of built around recognizing governors of states who had troops at Gettysburg. So you have
recognizing the governors,
the current governors. So you have about 11 to 15 governors on the stage out there at the Peace Light.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, gotcha.
There had been, prior to the official opening, 2 days earlier, there had been the largest field mass in the country out at the Peace Light, organized by a Notre Dame alumni association that wanted to dedicate a tablet at the Father Corby statue, recognizing Father Corby's role. And they organized this massive field mass, which they openly say the idea here is we need to demonstrate that Catholics are loyal Americans. This is, of course, after Kennedy's run for presidency, where there are a lot of charges leveled against him that as a Catholic, he can't be president of the United States.
He'd be loyal to the Pope.
He can't be loyal. Exactly. Yeah. So there's this, and this is just the first of so many examples where there is a clear contemporary present day purpose for a commemorative activity. So you have that. Eisenhower speaks the next day at the Gettysburg Firemen's Carnival, which happens every year. This 1963 was the biggest. Eisenhower gives,
and Eisenhower's living here, right? At the time.
Yep. He's
the resident president.
He is the resident president. He gives a speech that a lot of people take offense to. It's a speech that really doesn't talk about the Civil War much at all. It's a speech that never in any way acknowledges race or civil rights. It's a speech largely about welfare, a speech about how we need to avoid being dependent on the government. And the speech really it's the black press is furious at Gettysburg.
What don't they like about that?
They say, how can you stand at Gettysburg, the place where Lincoln gave this speech about a new birth of freedom, about government for the people, by the people, of the people, after Tuscaloosa, after the University of Alabama, after Birmingham, after we have this legislation in Congress? How can you go to stand at this iconic spot and not say, we have an unfinished struggle for justice in this country?
Okay, so
there was an expectation that he make that link between civil rights and the Civil War that many other people did during the Gettysburg anniversary, but he did not.
It wasn't saying necessarily that I find this offensive because we all should rely on government. It was saying if you think we're just relying on government because we're lazy, you're missing the whole struggle, the whole point. It's only been 100 years and you put up obstacles and all this other. Is that basically the point?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
So there's that. There's this event at the Peace Light where the Assistant Secretary of the Interior calls on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. He says it's the unfinished business that Lincoln spoke of. You have this legislation in front of you. You need to act. That's the 1st of July. The 2nd of July, there's a massive parade downtown, all kinds of floats, military bands. There's a historical section. There's a contemporary section. The description of the floats is fascinating. They were so choreographed. They were we're talking about a parade on the scale that really had not been seen in Gettysburg.
Wow.
Since
ever,
basically. Apparently, the most popular float was a National Guard unit that their float depicted a mobile bathing unit. So they had a soldier in the shower.
Oh,
This
really?
float is moving down Baltimore Street.
What's the point of that?
So that's the big activity on July 2nd. July 3rd, there's what they call, very specifically, a symbolic reenactment of Pickett's charge. It's not a reenactment because that's not acceptable.
Right.
Symbolic. So couple thousand men in Confederate gray crossing the field, climbing the fence, moving toward the high water mark. Couple thousand Union defenders standing at the stone wall. The Confederates cross. There's this pre-recorded script being narrated by somebody really famous. I can't think of who it was off the top of my head. There's recorded sounds of gunfire. According to many people who were there, it was incredibly moving. According to some other people, you couldn't hear anything. And there's scuffles with the press who were, the photographers are trying to get a good shot. And people are apparently getting so angry about the photographers getting in their way that they're like shaking the platforms that they're standing on. And somebody almost falls off.
Wow.
But there's this moment of silence where the troops sort of stop and stare at each other. And it's whether it was moving or not, I think depends on where you were standing and how you perceived the event. But it drew about 40,000 people. It was the biggest event of the centennial. There's also, throughout those 3 days, there are these scripted, they called them historical vignettes, playing out across the battlefield. They are written and directed by a local resident, Betty Gifford, who was working with a New York City-based playwright who had created a pageant about Lincoln's arrival in Gettysburg. In November, she had created this large-scale pageant that took place here in 1952, and she was brought back to consult on centennial things. And so she worked with Betty Gifford to plan these. I forget how many there were, 7 or 8. They're all across the battlefield, and they repeated multiple times throughout each day, and visitors kind of ranged from different ones to different ones, and they were super popular. They stressed sort of all of the Brothers' War themes, all of the you literally had one about brothers discovering each other on the battlefield. You had kind of an apocryphal one about the sharing of water at Spangler Spring. You had one about John Burns. There was a wide range of these, and all staffed, all done by local people. These were super popular. There was the Firemen's Carnival in the evening. There were all sorts of mobile exhibits everywhere, kind of relics on display. A lot of the churches that had been field hospitals were open for rest and rejuvenation. They were open for tours. You had Park Service programs. So a lot of things kind of coalescing. You also had the Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission. They were very involved with these historical vignettes. And they also, between 1961 and 1965, they mounted several large-scale historical pageants commemorating different moments in Adams County's Civil War history. In the summer of 1963, their big pageant was Jeb Stuart's raid on Gettysburg. It took place on Baltimore Street. You had simulated firing in the streets. You had the capture of the courthouse, where the president of the borough council, was portrayed by his great-grandson. You had a lot of these pageants throughout the 60s. You had descendants of local people playing their ancestors. They do a big one in 1961, marking the departure of the first unit from Gettysburg in April of 1960.
The Independent Blues.
April of 1861, and it's incredibly popular. Like 350 people participating. People across the county sewing period costumes that they then wore, again and again and again. Apparently, the big surprise of the 1961 pageant was when they fired the cannon. It broke like 14 windows in the square. So that was unexpected.
They didn't think that would happen, did they?
They did another one in February of 1962 commemorating an incident related to the Porter Guard unit, which had been encamped in Gettysburg in the winter of 1862. Snowstorm the day that they're supposed to give this pageant, but people still come out.
Oh, that's cool.
It was held at the courthouse. They did this. There was a big pageant out in Cashtown, again involving the raid on Cashtown, and that's in part what I mean by saying that
Chambersburg or Cashtown?
Both.
Okay.
Chambersburg does something, but the one in Cashtown is bigger, and the script is interesting because the script sort of connects the raid on Cashtown to civil wars breaking out across the globe, and they say, hopefully people in these other countries will learn from what we experienced and will not make the mistakes that we did.
Okay.
In November of 1963, there are multiple events commemorating the Gettysburg Address.
Right.
The most interesting of which I think is a program at Gettysburg College that is a forum hosted by the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, where he has a panel of ambassadors and political leaders from a variety of different countries talking about the international impact of the Gettysburg Address, the way the ideas of the Gettysburg Address are understood in their countries. And Rusk explicitly talks about the Gettysburg Address kind of undergirding American foreign policy, particularly in Africa. And he talks about American racial abuses and how that's undermining undermining diplomatic efforts across the globe. There's this explicit connection, again, to the present. In 1962, there's the dedication of the old Cyclorama building, what we think of as the old Cyclorama building, which of course at the time was the new Cyclorama building.
But that was the visitor center too, right?
It was the first visitor center at Gettysburg National Military Park. They'd been trying to build it for years. It was finally built in the 1960s using Mission 66 funds.
What was Mission 66?
Mission 66 was a Park Service program that was launched in the 1950s to modernize the national parks and to get them ready for expanded visitation by
1966.
Exactly.
Okay.
Park Service visitation rates continued to climb through the 1940s into the 1950s. Park budgets didn't keep pace with that. And when Eisenhower comes into office, he recognizes this need to modernize the parks. He recognizes that that our society is becoming increasingly suburban, increasingly automobile driven, that tourism is changing and it's growing, and that the parks aren't ready for it. So the idea was, we will get the parks to where they need to be to serve the visiting population that is coming. By the 1960s, the population is even higher than the Mission 66 numbers had projected, and the tie-in with the centennial allows for the funding of Richard Neutra's Cyclorama Center, which we here in Gettysburg tend to think of in large part as a somewhat problematic building. At the time, though, Neutra was world-renowned. The high-ranking officials in the Park Service were thrilled that he had taken the commission. He had an incredibly elaborate vision for that building. He didn't want to just build a visitor center or a place to house the Cyclorama painting. He wanted to build a living monument to Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to build a building that would be integral to international diplomacy, literally.
Yep.
He believed that building could help prevent nuclear war. He built the building to...
I read that in the introduction that you sent me last night, and I go, really?
Yeah.
Like, how is that building going to do that?
So what he wanted, what he believed was that the building could facilitate an annual program where a leader from a different country every year would be invited to speak to a huge audience here in Gettysburg about political ideals about their country, that this could be connected with the State Department, that these visits would offer an opportunity for these leaders to sort of see American political principles at work, to see American technology at work, and to come away wanting that technology.
Right.
and believing in those political principles. So, I think we all know that the Cyclorama building was originally intended, those doors on the outside were intended to open so that the auditorium inside and the lawn outside would be connected, that there would be this.
Which doors are you talking about?
So if you were standing on the lawn looking at the old building, you have the drum to the right.
Yeah, okay,
underneath.
Gotcha.
Those doors, those glass doors, they were supposed to open.
Okay.
So there was supposed to be an open air auditorium, essentially. And Neutra believed that if these international leaders would come, tour the battlefield, learn about Lincoln, learn about American political principles, give these addresses, connect with American people, see that technology, see, building walls disappearing with the push of a button, see sound and light shows, see blinds that, raised and lowered by themselves, that they would come away believing that these political principles were for real, and believing that by aligning themselves with the United States, they would have access to this technology. So his vision was grandiose. I mean, he believed that building would last forever. He believed that it would be a shrine to the free world, I think was his take on it. He wanted the...
we couldn't wait to get rid of it.
I mean, by 1965, it already had a maintenance backlog. There were issues... The issues with that building emerged during the construction process. All sorts of things were wrong during the construction process. It was late. It was behind schedule. The concrete didn't pour correctly. There were allegations of mismanagement. There were allegations of shoddy workmanship. So it's a wonder it lasted as long as it did.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. But those doors are basically not workable by 1965.
Wow.
But in 1962, it's being written up on the front page of Architectural Digest. It's being called the most impressive public building in Pennsylvania. It's being called the most impressive visionary visitor center in the National Park Service system. I mean, it's being called the Park Service's greatest contribution to the Civil War centennial. It was intended to be a lasting legacy.
I like the guy who said it looked like a gas tank, because that's what it looked like. It always looked like industrial to me. It was very ugly. If I had a choice, if you gave me a choice, Matt, you can either bring back the old Cyclorama building or the old National Tower. I'd bring back the National Tower. That's how much I thought that building.
That is serious dislike.
Because you know why? Because from the National Tower, you can see everything. And it's a unique view. I mean, who hasn't been in a building before? And from a building, you can only see so far. But from the air, I just didn't agree with them blasting country music over the cemetery. That was the big problem I had with that. But okay, so so before we get to this part, we got some speakers. We mentioned George Wallace before. Are they all speaking at the same event, or are there several events going on around, who else besides George Wallace?
There are a lot of events taking place around the battlefield. Okay. The official program lists, I don't know, maybe 27 different events, and that's just the official program. There are a lot of monument dedications and rededications taking place. There are special services, special ceremonies, special commemorations. There's the parade. There's all kinds of different things happening.
Right.
So there are moments where there are a lot of politicians together, and then there are moments where people are more spread out. Wallace is probably looking back today, Wallace is probably the most high profile. But at the time, the governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, was very active, very present. William Scranton in 1963 was being considered potentially a front runner for the Republican nomination for the presidency in the following year. He's he's a moderate. He's somebody who believes in the importance of new civil rights legislation. Okay. And the fact that Barry Goldwater eventually gets the nomination means the Republican Party by 1964 is moving in a very different direction than it looked like it might go in 1963. So in 1963, William Scranton's a very important figure. You have, like I said, you have the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. You have tons of state governors, tons of Pennsylvania officials. Wallace is the name that most resonates with us.
Because he was nationally, he made national news.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but, okay, so now you've got all these people that come and they make their speeches and everything like that. But what I found interesting from what I read last night in your introduction, 11 out of the 14 restaurants here didn't serve black people.
That was that was early 1950s.
Oh, 50s.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
By 60s, that's right. Because didn't the commission come in and say, "Hey guys, maybe you shouldn't do this at least for this weekend"? Is that kind of the gist of it? Certainly,
things were changing throughout the 1950s. Those policies were being challenged.
Yeah.
And the enforcement of the law is becoming a little more stepped up.
Right.
But there's still enough of a recognition that public accommodations in Adams County and in the surrounding area are not really always open to everybody. By 1963, that the Pennsylvania State Human Relations Commission does in the spring of 63, they launch a specific campaign to remind merchants in this area of the fact that Pennsylvania had a public accommodations law. And They come in person to talk to them about it. They come with copies of the law in hand and they say, please put this in your windows. The goal certainly is to avoid embarrassing incidents, to avoid incidents like the ones that took place in Charleston in 1961 that would draw a lot of negative attention to Gettysburg, to Pennsylvania, and to the commemoration of the war as a whole. And they get a friendly response. But the very fact that the mayor of Gettysburg acknowledges, like 2 weeks before the anniversary, that where he feels that there's a specific need to say publicly, reservations will be honored, everyone will be served in restaurants. It shows that if you need to say it, if you need to make sure it's posted in your window,
right.
If you need to pay personal calls to
businesses
to make sure that they're aware of the law,
you got a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not on the scale of the early 1950s. Certainly public accommodation, access to public accommodations was shifting in Pennsylvania between the 1950s and 1960s. But
yeah, go ahead.
It's still an issue.
Have you ever read a book by Jim Weeks?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
In there, there's a story. I think it was from the Gettysburg Times, or I don't know if the Times was the paper then, but whatever the paper was at the time, and it was from the earlier 1900s. And basically, the gist of it that I got from the book, and I read it years ago, so I could be jumbling a couple of different sources up here, but whatever. The gist is that the attitude in the black community, let's say around 1900, was we're finally, free. Now we're Americans. Let's learn about our country and let's be a part of it. Like they tried, and they would come up. Churches from Baltimore would come up from. You remember the story?
Absolutely.
They would come up here. They wouldn't be allowed to stay in town. They had to stay out at the campgrounds, like Round Top Campground or something like that. They stay out of town. And then, the ones that would come into town and that would go to the restaurants that would serve them, they would get drunk, and then it would be in the paper the next day. But the way they describe them, I remember one story, and these are not my words, but it was about a Negro wench with, like, she was drunk as a skunk, walking down, I forget which road, Baltimore Street maybe, with like a child in tow at like 1 a.m. and it was just this like, but that's in the paper the next day. It's hard to say, you hear people that say, yeah, you got to get over it. It's about time you got over it. Like slavery was 150 years ago. Well, yeah, that's true. But it's not like it was like, okay, slavery's over, marry my daughter. There was a lot of crap, like horrible crap that they had to go through all those years. And and this is the point, but the reason why I bring this up and I'm kind of dwelling on it is that Gettysburg is in the north. And what frustrates me, and whenever I try to do, like with the free episodes that I do, and subtle ways, I try to, I guess, bash you over the head in a subtle way with the fact that being in the north did not mean that you loved all peoples. And being in the South did not mean that you were this foaming at the mouth, fanged racist who hated black people more than other people, but hates everybody. And to this day, that rings true. All human beings are horrible no matter where they live. So Gettysburg, as this example of the Civil War, and what's the Civil War? Today we look at it, it's a struggle over freedom and slavery and all this stuff. And then Gettysburg itself, not very long ago, was probably a little better than, say, somewhere in the deep South, but not much.
Yeah, this is a community with a history of segregation, a long history of segregation that, excuse me, the National Park Service officials, high level, Washington level, in the late 1950s, who were looking ahead to the commemoration of the Civil War, there was a group who said, we shouldn't try to commemorate the war broadly. We should focus on one place and one story, and it should be Gettysburg. All of our efforts should be Gettysburg because it's so well known, because it's the man on the street battle, because it's a good geographical location. It's close to Washington. But tellingly, their final reason was, and because it doesn't have segregation issues and we're not going to be embarrassed nationally by clashes over race. Not true. Gettysburg has a Black community with a history of segregation and discrimination. There was a segregated school in Gettysburg into the 1930s, despite the fact that Pennsylvania state law said that that school segregation was unconstitutional. The 1960s, employment discrimination and housing discrimination are the two biggest racial issues in Gettysburg. Finding a home outside of the Third Ward, virtually impossible still in 1963. Yeah. That community didn't just grow up in that area organically. It grew up in that area because real estate agents wouldn't show properties outside of it, because restrictive covenants were in effect on properties, because there was a perception amongst many whites in the community that that's their place. They need to stay there. Because it was,
since the colonial days, that was traditionally like the Black area of town.
There have always been individuals who have lived out in the county, individuals who have lived outside of the borough.
If you're in town, Washington Street, that is the area where the Black neighborhood was.
And it became even more tightly circumscribed there.
But that's what I'm saying. Initially, it might not have been, you all have to go over there. Right. But as time went on, it became, oh, you're there already? Good. You can't come out here. Right? Is that more accurate?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And while Gettysburg doesn't have, while there's not a lot of documentation about sort of explicit violence related to housing segregation as exists in many other places, there are certainly real estate agents on the record saying, I would never show an African-American client anything out of the Third Ward.
I'm sure they didn't say African-American.
No, they did not. That's where they live. The white people don't want to live near them. But in the 1950s, the Third Ward was never exclusively Black. There were white families in the Third Ward as well. Poor white too. Yeah. And not even poor necessarily. Oh, really? Because the Third Ward, it's not the ward itself. It was even within the ward, there were always sort of streets or sides of streets that were white. Correct. And
still are.
And by the 60s, segregation had actually constricted the space available to Black residents. There were homes that had been owned by Blacks that had been purchased by whites. But homes owned by whites couldn't be purchased by Blacks. So there's more and more doubling up. There's more and more overcrowding. Employment segregation, huge percentage of Gettysburg's Black population into the 1960s had to work outside of Gettysburg because there was nothing here, except for menial employment, except for, cleaning motel rooms, except for, there was a shoe factory. But aside from that, into the 1960s, many members of the Black community here are traveling to Letterkenny. They're traveling to the Naval Supply Depot up in Mechanicsburg. They're traveling to D.C. Their employment opportunity here is virtually non-existent.
Now, you said shoe factory, but we want to make sure we're talking about the 20th century.
Yes, we are talking about the 1960s.
Yes.
Although I do have a somewhat funny story about how, this is unrelated, but there's a group of North Carolina reenactors in 1963 who go somewhere downtown. It's a prearranged stunt. And I don't know if it's to the borough office or what, but they go somewhere and they demand shoes. And a local shoe company had donated some shoes to give them, and they're like ladies' slippers. and there's this big, like, orchestrated thing going on about that. But,
I like when people throw humor in with stuff. Now, just for the sake of those of you who aren't who are familiar with Gettysburg, but not to the point of knowing where the Third Ward is. The Third Ward would be what, the southwest quadrant of town, basically.
Oh, don't ask me directions.
Okay,
it's the part of downtown that includes Breckenridge Street, parts of High Street, Franklin Street,
Washington Street,
absolutely.
Colt Park.
Yes.
Steinway Avenue.
Yes.
The
Colt
Rec
Park was pretty much exclusively white. But
right. That was not here at the Centennial, was it? When was that
Colt
built?
Park was Colt Park was
under construction.
1950s, 1960s. That's when Colt Park.
Oh, so that was relatively new then. Okay. Okay. So then, now, how did the Centennial celebrations, how did that affect the way we still view Gettysburg today and all the years in between? Like,
I think in several different ways. On a very practical level, Centennial commemorations, the publicity brought to Gettysburg, the idea of the importance of a 100th anniversary, it did kickstart a lot of preservation efforts. The Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association is founded in 1959. One of their great goals is to use the centennial year to save as much land as they can, because the national attention is focused here.
Was that was Charlie Weaver involved then?
Yes.
Or he was involved at that point?
Absolutely.
Okay. And Charlie Weaver is Rosanna Arquette's grandfather.
Oh, okay.
And David Arquette, all the Arquettes.
Okay.
They all have the same grandfather.
Yes. Yes.
That's their grandfather.
I did not realize
Cliff
that. Cliff
Arquette.
Arquette. I did not realize he was their grandfather.
I heard her on the Gilbert Gottfried podcast like a year ago. And she mentioned she remembers coming here to see her grandfather.
Yeah, his museum was...
Yeah, it was a big deal. Yep. He would go on the Tonight Show and like, what did he do? Sell like an inch of the battlefield or something?
Yep, a square foot, I think.
Square foot.
Yes.
You didn't physically get a square foot of it.
No, you got a deed. You got a certificate saying that
and that's
that
to raise money for
this.
Preservation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The 50s, the lead up to the centennial, the lead up to the construction of Neutra's Visitor Center, there's a lot of attention focused on the way that development was eating up land in Gettysburg. There was a lot of attention focused on the idea of local people profiting in inappropriate ways from this battlefield, and hamburger stands on the sacred ground and everything. And the centennial played a big role in giving direction to a lot of the fights over zoning, in giving direction to efforts to save land through private acquisition when it became clear that zoning was not going to fix was not going to fix the problem. There was a lot of land saved and added to the boundary of Gettysburg National Military Park that probably wouldn't have been saved without the attention brought to the issue through the centennial. It's also shaped the memorial landscape of the battlefield.
Okay, how do you mean?
The centennial years brought a new wave of Confederate memorialization in Gettysburg. 1961, Georgia dedicates a state monument. 1963, Florida and South Carolina do. 1964, Texas does. 1965, there's the Soldiers and Sailors of the Confederacy Memorial. This wave continues into the early 1970s. Louisiana, Mississippi, that part of Confederate Avenue, that's a legacy of the centennial.
Right. So, and that's a good point to bring up. That stuff wasn't put up by the veterans.
No.
That was put up afterwards by the states. And what is the, I guess political context of that? Why does it get to, how come that wasn't up before? Why the centennial? And how did that come about?
Well, long history to that. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association wasn't interested in having Confederate monuments on the battlefield. This was a Union memorial park. The veterans associations, the Union veterans associations, were very opposed to the idea of Confederate monumentation. When the idea of a Lee memorial first gets floated years before the Virginia Memorial is erected, the veterans are irate. When the War Department takes over management of the battlefield, of course, they install the tablets that tell the story.
Right.
So the Confederate lines are marked for the first time
with the brigade plaques,
exactly,
markers or whatever.
But those tablets are intended to be very factual. This group was here. They did this. These were their numbers. They're
very dry. There's no art to them. Right.
And
it's factual.
So there's a long history here. The Virginia, of course there's the what is it? The Second Maryland. That's the first Confederate monument on the battlefield. Then there's Virginia. Then during the Depression, there's North Carolina, because of course they have to continually fight with Virginia over the legacy of Pickett's charge. And, and then there's Alabama in the 1930s, but there still aren't very many until the centennial, when there are now these state Civil War centennial commissions that have a budget, that are looking to make some sort of lasting contribution to the memory of the Civil War. And a lot of them look to Gettysburg and they say, my state doesn't have a monument at Gettysburg. We need to do something about that. And in the context of this Brothers' War interpretation, there's a real belief that we need to sort of level the playing field, the commemorative playing field. We need to have both sides represented. We need to have these monuments. And to be frank, the approval process is not nearly as stringent as it could have been. The Park Service has a policy, there's a through which new monuments have to be proposed and approved, and there's all these things that are supposed to happen. But for many of the monuments that are the Confederate monuments that are dedicated in the 1960s, that approval process is either very short because people didn't get their paperwork in on time, but have announced publicly that they are dedicating a memorial at Gettysburg on this date, and the Park Service has no plans and no information and no nothing, but it gets rushed through really, really quickly. That's what happened with Georgia. Or outside pressure is brought to bear. Senators, South Carolina senators, Florida senators, they're calling up Conrad Worth, the director of the Park Service's office in D.C., the spring of 1963. They're saying, I want this wording approved. If you go out and you look at the wording on some of these monuments from the 1960s, South Carolina being a particularly strong example of that, you see wording that is not only incredibly subjective, but wording that is so explicitly political that it wouldn't have been approved when the Virginia monument was erected at a time that we tend to think of as sort of the low point in American race relations. Right. There was language for the Virginia Memorial about our brave sires or their glorious cause, or things that the Park Commission and the War Department says, no way, this is not going on a monument. No praise, no blame. By the 1960s, pressure from these influential Southern senators in D.C., the need to move quickly, the need to have these public dedication ceremonies during the centennial period, it allows language to get through that otherwise probably wouldn't have.
Clever. Here's what it says. That men of honor might forever know the responsibilities of freedom, dedicated South Carolinians stood and were counted for their heritage and convictions, abiding faith in the sacredness of states' rights provided their creed. Here many earned eternal glory. Is that the part you're talking about?
Yeah. Mississippi Monument says something somewhat similar. The inscription for the Mississippi Monument was actually written by a Mississippi judge named Tom Brady, who had been one of the
not
that Tom Brady, who had been one of the most outspoken voices in the aftermath of Brown v. Board of Education about the utter doom that this would bring to white civilization. Brady went around the state giving speeches to citizens' councils. He was more instrumental than almost anyone in the rise of the violent citizens' council movement in Mississippi.
Mississippi says, on this ground our brave sires fought for their righteous cause. In glory they sleep who give to it their lives. To valor they gave new dimensions of courage, to duty its noblest fulfillment, to posterity the sacred heritage of honor.
And this is the early 1970s when that's dedicated.
Wow.
It's not during the centennial, but it's part of this wave that begins during the centennial. One thing I should mention in relation to Mississippi, in 1966, there's a major civil rights march taking place in Mississippi, James Meredith's March Against Fear. Meredith gets shot during the march. He can't continue. All the major civil rights organizations send representatives to continue it. It's the last huge nonviolent march of the civil rights era.
Except for him getting shot.
And, yes, I mean, and
nonviolent on the part of the protesters.
Exactly. And in response to this, various branches of the Pennsylvania Ku Klux Klan want to launch a countermarch, and they say, we're going to start at Gettysburg at the Mississippi State Monument. That's our launching point for our hate march, essentially. There isn't a Mississippi State Monument at Gettysburg in 1966. There are these accounts of these Klansmen wandering around the battlefield looking for this monument that doesn't exist. And then later on, they're spotted marching down the road through two taverns, and then they don't get to Littlestown. It's unclear.
Where are they trying to go? Washington?
Apparently Mississippi. I don't know. I don't know a lot about it, but my point is that monuments are important. We use monuments to symbolically legitimize a lot of things, and that kind of legitimacy is what they are looking for from the battlefield at that moment.
Yeah, we always say on whenever monuments come up when we're on the show here, we always say that they tell you more about who put them up than who they're memorializing.
Yeah.
I think you might have said something like that in your intro, right?
I say that a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's true.
The Florida Monument out on West Confederate Avenue. It's one that nobody pays much attention to. Nope. It's not very visually interesting. Has a lot of text. Pretty standard text. Has some similarities to South Carolina. At the end, it has this sort of vague, we're all Americans language or something like that, allowing us to confront this history allows us to confront any sacrifice we might face as Americans.
Yeah.
On the monument, that doesn't mean a lot. But during the dedication ceremony was the day after the South Carolina one. The South Carolina one had been very chest thumping, very anti-federalist. Dixie was played, Confederate flags everywhere. George Wallace is talking about destructive centralization and the need for white Southerners he doesn't explicitly say white Southerners, but he says the need to stand against these sort of Soviet-style policies and the need to uphold our individual liberties. This is 3 weeks after he's standing in the schoolhouse door. We know exactly what he's saying.
Right.
At Florida, American flags, no Dixie. The speaker is a congressman from South Florida who talks for 2 sentences about the Florida troops at Gettysburg and spends the entire rest of the time talking about foreign policy and saying that if we continue to have clashes in the streets and civil rights protesters being attacked by dogs and being beaten, we are going to lose all of our potential allies in Africa and in Asia. We are going to lose our voting power in the UN. We are going to nobody is going to believe our political ideals. Right. Nobody is going to ally with us. We are going to lose the future of the world. And we will squander all the death that happened here. And he makes this really interesting point about, at the time of this battle, the effects were largely contained to the United States. And he says today that's not the case. What happens in our country, our racial battles today, they have worldwide implications. And so he's basically calling on the legacy of the Florida troops and saying, if we don't stop this, if we don't move our debates to the legislative chamber, if we don't move our debates to the ballot box, we will have dishonored the sacrifices of the soldiers at Gettysburg. And this is a Southern state monument. He's talking about Confederate memory. It's a very different Confederate memory than what's being talked about at the South Carolina monument the day before. And that's kind of my larger point with the project. There is no one single narrative about the centennial. There is no one single idea of how the history of the battle can be marshaled. There are multiple different interpretations, and some of them are overlapping and some of them are opposed, but they are all playing out here at Gettysburg.
Right. It's interesting because Florida, I always found, I remember when I first learned that there were Florida troops here. I don't know how much younger, it's 20 years or whatever it was ago. It seemed weird to me because Florida, it's where Disney World is. It's
Not
where
1863.
It's where old people go to die, like to be warm before they die. Like I never thought of it as a state in rebellion. Of course it was, but the fact that there were American flags at the centennial, at the dedication, and it was a little bit about the Florida troops and the rest of it was about we as Americans today, didn't surprise me one bit, and that's probably why I don't think of Florida as a Confederate state, a former Confederate state, because it grew up. It got past it, and it's not. I don't know many people. First of all, I don't know many people from Florida who live in Florida. Most of them grew up in the north, and they end up down there. That could help, but they just seem to understand. It's like, okay, well, we lost it, so let's move on. This is where we are now, and let's make the best of it now.
And yet, in the 1960s, that was still very contested in Florida. Florida was transforming dramatically between the end of World War II and 1970. Florida transformed dramatically.
What was the
space race? Travel, tourism, demographics.
Right.
So you have the space race utterly transforms the demographics of Florida communities.
Because they have smart people there.
They have all these people from all across the country who are moving into Florida.
Right.
I think the county surrounding Cape Canaveral was the fastest growing county in the United States at the time of the dedication. You have the increasing migration of retirees to Florida, which is again dramatically transforming
and they're all from the
population
north.
demographics. And you have a substantial influx from Cuba.
Yeah.
So the population of Florida is really, really changing quickly.
And let's not forget the mafia.
Well, there's that too.
The mafia likes Florida too, and they don't like Hicks. So,
And the Florida Democratic Party is suddenly split between these traditional Southern conservatives and all of these Northern Democratic transplants who are bringing their labor unions and their different ideas, to a certain extent, different ideas about race, not entirely different.
Right.
And so Florida is very conflicted in the 1960s, and yet there are still incredibly violent civil rights demonstrations. Like St. Augustine is one of the events in St. Augustine are some of the most violent of the entire civil rights era, and that's 1964. That's after.
So that's interesting that you say
that. School
desegregation,
huge battles across the state.
Yeah.
So it is and it isn't at the same time. It is moving away from that past, and it isn't.
Right.
It's battling.
Change is painful.
And you kind of see that in this dedication. And then you have this very traditional language, but the spin that the speaker gives it is not traditional.
No, it's funny that you not funny, but it's interesting that you mentioned St. Augustine, because I was reading the introduction, you mentioned it there, and I go, what the hell happened to St. Augustine? Never heard of it, but you're saying it's the most violent of the demonstrations.
One of the most, and went on for months. Nighttime marches, assaults by the Ku Klux Klan.
Really?
Swim-ins at hotel pools where owners are pouring acid in the pools to get the demonstrators out. I mean, it is
Wait,
brutal.
where do you get acid?
I'm not even sure. But the mother of the governor of Massachusetts gets arrested in a demonstration. The woman's like 90 years old, and she says, "I'm going to jail." I mean, it.
Wow, St. Augustine.
It's compelling.
1964.
Yes, and
I'll have to look into that.
Those are Southern Christian Leadership Conference largely sponsored demonstrations. Martin Luther King is in St. Augustine repeatedly, and it's incredibly violent and depressing. And it doesn't have, at the end, there are some compromises reached. There's some common ground, but it is small and incremental. We are not talking about a major victory at all. We're talking more about a stalemate.
Wow. Yeah, that's a crazy time in our history, the 60s. Almost as crazy as the 1860s. Close, but it wasn't.
Close.
It wasn't there.
Well, I like that's where that phrase "Civil War of the 1960s" comes in. And, like historians throw that around because there's that interesting parallel between these two decades, 100 years apart, that are both so traumatic and chaotic and complicated, and the pace of change is so rapidly, is so rapidly accelerated. And yet, I think we also have to acknowledge that it's not just a metaphor. Like the Civil War, the commemoration of the Civil War, the memory of the Civil War, battles over that memory, it's part and parcel of the changes of the 1960s.
Yeah. You don't have to be two armies standing facing each other on a farm somewhere to be in a civil war. It takes many forms, and usually it starts off as a Cold War and then it grows into a hot war. So, Dr. Jill, this was so much fun I don't know anything about this stuff, so it was very fascinating to do this. You're working on a book now.
I am, yes.
You don't have you're almost certain you have the title, but you're not totally
correct.
certain. So the working title is what?
Gettysburg, 1963, Race and Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town.
But the important thing is, when it comes out, we'll have you back on to talk about it, and then we'll know for sure what the title is.
That's right. It'll be if I don't know that at that point, I'm going to be very concerned.
Yeah, but otherwise, and you've done other things though. You've done a few podcasts as well, right? Haven't you?
Not podcasts so much.
You've been on a podcast.
I've been interviewed here and there for a variety of things.
I wish Bob was here because he's got the flu today, but I wish he was here to hear this because he would have loved this. So we're definitely going to have you back on for Bob's sake, but also when the book comes out so that people know the name of it and they can go and get it. Dr. Jill Titus was your name, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. It's been fun talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. All right, there you go. That was it.
All right.
I hope I didn't cut you off.